civil servant has been charged under the Official Secrets Act with leaking information during the circuit breaker last year.
What do we know about Singapore's newest COVID-19 cluster? It's linked to a man who was probably reinfected in India.
Will Singapore be Australia's next travel bubble partner? We'll have the latest chatter on that from Sydney.
You're watching The Big Story, coming to you live from the Straits Times newsroom. I'm Olivia Quay.
I'm Harianto Dimani. You can subscribe to the Straits Times channel so you never miss a single episode. One community case was among the 15 new COVID-19 infections reported today.
The remaining cases were imported and placed on stay-home notice when they arrived. More details will be released later tonight.
The personal assistant to the Singapore Food Agency's Director General was charged today under the Official Secrets Act with leaking information on school closures and home-based learning during the circuit breaker last year.
Nurain Jubli faces 2 charges for the wrongful communication of information. Her husband also faces one such charge and another for soliciting a wrongful communication of information.
Nurain had accessed the classified information from her boss's email inbox and allegedly sent it to her husband before it was officially released. He's said to have then sent it to friends. The couple are out on bail and are expected to plead guilty on June the 11th.
Meanwhile, in its daily update last night, the Health Ministry reported a new COVID-19 cluster involving an Indian national who had been discharged.
The man had been deemed as no longer infectious then, but MOH found he had later infected his sister-in-law and her husband.
Recapping the sequence of events, the 43-year-old man is here on a work pass and was classified as an imported case when he tested positive on April the 2nd. MOH said he was hospitalized, where authorities found that he had a low viral load and the presence of antibodies based on a positive serology test result on April the 4th.
Plus, his pre-departure test, taken on March 31st, had also came back negative, so he was discharged on April 6th without being required to isolate as he was deemed to be no longer infectious. But then on April 17th, the man was identified as a close contact of his sister-in-law and subsequently tested positive.
We're now joined by Associate Professor Alex Cook, Vice Dean of Research at the Saw Swee Hock School of Public Health. Prof, based on what we know about this case, should MOH reassess how they discharge patients?
Well, the test that we use to confirm whether an infection happens or not is usually the swab followed by a PCR test. The problem with this test is that a positive swab result can mean one of 2 things. It could mean that the patient is an active case, so they're currently infectious, or it could mean that they recently recovered in the last few weeks or maybe the last month or so. And we cannot tell just from the PCR test alone which one of these 2 scenarios it is. And that's important for infection control because it determines whether we're going to ward the patient or whether we can send them home. So what we do is we tend to have the second test, the serology test. That's looking for, not for virus in the blood, but it's looking for antibodies to see whether you've been infected in the past or not. Now, if you are positive on the serology test, that would usually mean that you're infected at least 2 weeks ago, or maybe more than that. So for the index case for this cluster, this was someone who was PCR positive, but was also serology positive. Now, the PCR test was quite a low viral load, but they were still positive on PCR and then positive on serology. Now, the assumption would be that with that it's probably not an active infection, it was an old infection. That would have determined what happened to the patient after being released. Now, the problem is that now we're starting to see reinfection cases. It's not quite clear that a PCR positive and a serology positive combination still means that the person has recovered from a recent infection or not. You can imagine someone who might have been infected a year ago or late last year, who would therefore be serology positive because of the previous infection. That person could have a reinfection now and therefore be active now to that reinfection, but they would test positive in both tests. So this has until now really been a kind of like an academic thought experiment rather than real life practice. So what this reinfection case tells us is 2 things. One, that yes, it's important that we assess how we interpret the combination of serology positive and a PCR positive in the light of the fact that it could now be reinfection cases. I don't know what the answer to that is, but it's something that we should be thinking about now. The second is it shows the importance of continued vigilance and the safe management measures that we have in place in order to keep control of epidemics as they happen in the community, because we will get some more cases like this cluster, and it's important we can deal with it.
Professor, from Thursday, all travellers from India must serve an additional 7-day stay-home notice at their place of residence after they quarantine for 14 days at a dedicated facility.
Singapore will also allow entry and transit for those with recent travel history to South Africa and the UK, but they'll be subjected to an extra 7-day SHN period at their place of residence as well.
So, Professor, what do you make of the stricter border controls? Sufficient, or should borders be temporarily closed to travellers coming in from India?
The situation in India is quite worrying. The epidemic wave that they're experiencing just now is bigger than the first wave, and it seems to be still in this exponential growth phase. So because of that, on a per capita basis, there's quite a lot of risk for an individual traveller coming over from India to Singapore. On top of that, there's quite large flows of travellers from India to Singapore. So we're kind of like at these two different levels of risk. We've got a per capita risk is quite high, so there's a high probability of an individual passenger being infected, but also there's quite a large number of passengers. So because of that, I think it does make sense that we think about tightening up the border to India. There's, I guess, two main ways we can do that. One is to make quarantine a little bit more onerous, so increasing the length to 3 weeks rather than 2 weeks. The other is to reduce the number of travellers coming into the country from India. So I think that we'll be looking at using a combination of both of these in order to keep the risk to Singapore at a maintained level.
So, Prof, while we are tightening border restrictions for travellers from India, the SHN period for travellers from Hong Kong will be reduced from 14 days to 7 days at their place of residence. But considering the virus's incubation period can be up to 14 days, are we risking leakage into the community?
Well, the border control is never going to be 100% effective. There's two different approaches that countries can take to border controls. One is that they could aim to try to get to zero community transmission and then to close off the border, to keep it a very strict amount of border control. This is the kind of approach that places like New Zealand or Taiwan have taken in the past. Another approach, which is the approach that Singapore has taken, is not to try to get to zero local cases, but to get to low local cases. And that is complemented then by a border measure which doesn't need to be 100% effective. We can tolerate a little bit of missed spillover infections into the community because we know that we've got enough safe management measures in place that we'll be able to control those. So, switching from 14 to 7 days for the quarantine from Hong Kong, of course, it slightly increases the risk, but the risk is already very low for travellers coming from Hong Kong into Singapore anyway. So I think that is quite a tolerable increase in risk. The other thing that I think is important to remember is that Hong Kong and Singapore are quite similar cities. The prevalence and the incidence of COVID in the two places is at quite similar levels. Therefore, someone traveling from Hong Kong to Singapore doesn't really increase the risk to Singapore. And similarly, a traveler from Singapore into Hong Kong doesn't increase the risk of spread within Hong Kong. So I think that given that, the change to slightly more relaxed measures for Hong Kong, given the epidemic situation they've got in Hong Kong at present, that actually seems to be quite a sensible approach, and it's one that I support.
Thanks for setting aside time to speak with us, Professor. We've been speaking with Associate Professor Alex Cook from the Saw Swee Hock School of Public Health at NUS.
Still on COVID-19, more than 2,000 deaths were recorded in India over 24 hours, a new high. Lax government rules and a new double mutant variant have been blamed for its second wave of infections, which added almost 3.5 million new cases this month alone. New Delhi's health minister has also urged the federal government to restore the oxygen supply chain, with some hospitals there running low.
Meanwhile, Australia is looking at Singapore as the next potential partner for quarantine-free travel bubble. These on the heels of a similar arrangement with New Zealand. Well, that bubble opened on Monday, which saw families reuniting after being separated for more than a year.
Now, the Straits Times reported last month that Australia is exploring ways to reboot its international education sector, including allowing vaccinated students from Singapore to re-enter or creating special student-only flights and quarantine facilities.
Let's hear more from our Australia correspondent, Jonathan Perlman. Hi, Jonathan. Jonathan, what is Australia's stance on having a similar travel bubble arrangement with Singapore? Now, we understand Prime Minister Scott Morrison has flagged Singapore as a potential next destination.
That's right. Australia is very keen to look to Singapore as the next potential bubble that Australia could have. Obviously, the New Zealand-Australia bubble has started this week, and there's a lot of excitement about that. And I think the thinking is that this could give confidence to Australia, really, to open up further bubbles. Australia's had such heavy travel restrictions, and so it will now look to other countries, and Singapore has been flagged as really the first potential destination after Australia. Michael McCormack, the Deputy Prime Minister, said that this week, that discussions apparently are underway between Australia and Singapore, according to the Deputy Prime Minister. And really the hope is that that Singapore would be the next step for Australia, and then potentially maybe also some Pacific countries.
Right. Well, before we get ahead of ourselves and start making travel plans or anything, Jonathan, what is the current COVID-19 situation in Australia?
So within Australia itself, things seem very normal. There are no real COVID restrictions in most of the country, or very limited restrictions. But life here is pretty much as normal because there's no community cases right now. There are cases within quarantine facilities, and basically there have been some occasional clusters that have emerged from quarantine facilities. But aside from that, within Australia, things are relatively normal, but there are very strict travel restrictions. Some states have different travel restrictions. Western Australia has been very reluctant to open its borders and to enter the New Zealand bubble. So things still vary state by state, and potentially, if and when there's some sort of bubble between Australia and Singapore, one thing that people will need to keep a lookout for is, do the states have different health requirements and different travel requirements? But beyond international travel, Australia's fairly free of COVID and has fairly light restrictions across the country.
Well, that's good to hear. Thank you so much for sharing the latest, Jonathan. That was the Straits Times' Australia correspondent, Jonathan Perlman. You can look out for his story on straitstimes.com.
Former Minneapolis policeman Derek Chauvin was convicted of murder in the arrest of George Floyd. After deliberating for over 10 hours, the 12-member jury found Chauvin guilty of all charges, including second-degree murder, third-degree murder, and manslaughter. Hundreds outside the courthouse erupted in cheers when the verdict was announced.
Meanwhile, U.S. President Joe Biden said Chauvin's murder conviction was too rare in a country plagued by systemic racism. He also called for meaningful police reform measures.
We also need Congress to act. George Floyd was murdered almost a year ago. There's meaningful police reform legislation in his name. Legislation to tackle systemic misconduct in police departments, to restore trust between law enforcement and the people they're entrusted to serve and protect. But it shouldn't take a whole year to get this done.
Here's the truth about racial injustice. It is not just a Black America problem or a people of color problem. It is a problem for every American. It is keeping us from fulfilling the promise of liberty and justice for all.
Meanwhile, former President Barack Obama praised the guilty verdict but emphasized that more work must be done to achieve justice. He wrote that, quote, "True justice requires that we come to terms with the fact that Black Americans are treated differently every day. It requires us to recognize that millions of our friends, family and fellow citizens live in fear that their next encounter with law enforcement could be their last."
In other news, in a few weeks, Instagram will have a feature to prevent users from viewing possibly abusive direct messages. The filter can be activated in Instagram's privacy settings, and it also can be customized to include words, phrases, and emoji that users want to block or avoid. Parent company Facebook said it will also make it harder for people blocked by users to circumvent and contact them through new accounts.
In sports, following outcry from football authorities to the fans, the 6 Premier League clubs in the breakaway European Super League have pulled out.
Manchester City were the first to go after Chelsea had signalled the same intent by preparing documentation to withdraw.
All 6 teams were founding members of the ESL, so where does that leave the competition?
Well, those remaining in the competition are Barcelona, Real Madrid, Atletico Madrid, as well as Juventus, AC Milan and Inter Milan. But according to an Italian news agency, Inter look likely to be the next to leave.
The ESL said it would now focus on efforts to, quote, reshape the project, while our sports correspondent believes it's dead in the water for now.
I think most analysts believe it is dead in the water. Even though, as you said, ESL president Florentino Perez said he was committed to getting the project up and running. Without half of the so-called founding clubs who are arguably the biggest draws too, particularly on this side of the globe, there's little hope it will actually take off. But like I said, it might only be dead just for now. It may well return in some other iteration. I'm quite certain it will. In fact, this is because there has always been a financial pressure on football clubs at the top. For at least the last 2 decades, and a Super League has been mooted as far back as 1998. And Perez himself was also behind a push in 2009. So I don't expect this to be the end at all. And to be honest, I don't think you can count the English clubs out either. In their statements when they withdrew, most sounded almost as though they were grudgingly giving up the idea. And as for how they can, sort of battle this criticism and bad feeling amongst the fans, how they can appease the fans, perhaps a more carefully planned, rollout, engagement with key supporter groups before actually pulling the trigger. So how real is that threat of losing fans, which spooked the clubs enough this time round? I'm not sure, but if they press on ahead next time, that could be the key question.
Experts are warning that Singapore will experience more intense and severe rainstorms, just like what we saw last Saturday.
Ahead of Earth Day tomorrow, the Straits Times hosted a webinar on climate change, looking at the urgent issue of rising sea levels.
Well, here's a short snippet of the discussion featuring the director of NTU's Earth Observatory of Singapore, Professor Benjamin Horton.
The rainfall that we experienced on Saturday will happen more frequently and will increase in its magnitude, because that's climate change. If you increase temperatures, you get more evapotranspiration from the oceans. That water vapours sat in the upper atmosphere, and there's only one way it's coming down, and it's coming down in intense rainfall. So a city like Singapore quite simply needs to become more resilient. But if you don't understand what you're having to be resilient to, it's very hard to adapt. So we need to quite quickly understand, what are our projections on rainfall? What are our projections on sea level? How do they come together as a compound threat to make sure that people's properties are safe, make sure that our lives are safe? We need to understand the science, then we can have proper adaptations. But I'll just repeat myself. Unless we reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, there is no adaptation solution available.
Well, also on the panel are NUS Senior Research Fellow Dr. Zheng Yiwen, as well as Director of PUB's Coastal Protection Department, Hazel Khoo.
The first episode of a new monthly webinar series, the full climate change discussion, will premiere at 8 p.m. tonight on ST's YouTube channel.
Well, those are our top stories for today. For more news and videos, visit straitstimes.com and, of course, subscribe to our YouTube channel by hitting the red button below.
Once again, I'm Hairianto Diman with Olivia Quay. Join us tomorrow for more stories on The Big Story.